Okay, welcome to the next module on the immune system, which is really a continuation of last week's module, since the inflammatory system can be part of the immune system, right? Inflammation is the initial part of where the body is protecting itself from potential antigens and potential invaders into the body. Okay, so the immune system is extremely important in the body's ability to protect itself from from potential invaders such as bacteria, viruses, and an assortment of other infectious processes. Now, the immune system can be weakened in different disease states, which we'll talk about. And when we have a weakened immune system, that opens us up to potential infections. The immune system can be hyperactive, and that can cause a variety of disease processes when the immune system, for example, attacks its own tissues. So we'll review and give examples of all of these parts of the immune system. Okay, so the immune system, what's its main role in the body? It's really to protect us from bacteria or viruses or really any foreign material that's entering the body, right? So all around us, we are constantly in contact with bacteria and viruses and other antigens that can enter the body. And without our immune system, they can set up infections in our body and create an assortment of disease states. Okay, so for the most part, the immune system is highly protective unless it becomes maladaptive. So how can the immune system become maladaptive? So if there's an excessive response from the immune system to a particular antigen, you can get what are called hypersensitivity reactions. So say, for example, your immune system is extremely sensitive to a certain drug. Well, it's going to respond when that drug comes into your system with a hypersensitivity reaction. For example, an allergic reaction. Okay? So how else can the immune system be maladaptive? Well, the immune system can sometimes detect that parts of itself or parts of the body are foreign. So there's a number of autoimmune diseases where the immune system feels that particular organs or systems in the body are foreign and decides to attack those parts of the body with the adaptive immune system. Okay, so diseases that are considered autoimmune, such as rheumatoid arthritis, systemic lupus, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and many others, are conditions where the adaptive immune system has decided that parts of the body are foreign, and it produces antibodies and other cells in the adaptive immune system to continually cause inflammation and destruction of cells in particular systems of the body. And each one of these diseases comes with its own symptoms and signs depending on what the immune system is attacking. Okay, so let's talk about hematopoiesis, which is the production of blood cells within the bone marrow. Okay, so all all of the blood cells are produced in the bone marrow, and they all originate from a cell called the stem cell. And the stem cell has the ability to become different cells that then circulate into the bloodstream. So within your bone marrow, the stem cell can become an erythrocyte, which is a red blood cell. It can be developed into a white blood cell, and there's 5 different types of white blood cells that we'll go over. And finally, it can develop into platelets. And all of these cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, will be released into the bloodstream and then circulate through the bloodstream to perform their functions. So for example, erythrocytes will have their main function of carrying oxygen that's packed into the erythrocytes. Okay? The white blood cells will be heavily involved in inflammation and also the immune system to protect the body from foreign invaders. And the platelets will be involved in the initial steps of stopping bleeding, which we're going to call the platelet plug. So when you cut yourself or when you injure yourself, the first cells that arrive in order to stop the bleeding are the platelets, and they form what's called a platelet plug. So looking at this slide, you can imagine if you have bone marrow suppression, what's going to happen to your 3 different cell lines: your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. So the first cell line that I mentioned are the erythrocytes, the red blood cells. Well, with bone marrow suppression, whether it's from a disease of the bone marrow or a chemotherapy drug that's being given to the patient, the red blood cells will reduce in production and you'll become anemic. Okay? And if you're anemic, you're unable to carry oxygen in the bloodstream, or at least you're unable to carry as much oxygen in the bloodstream. And that's going to cause fatigue, shortness of breath, potentially dizziness because there's not enough oxygen getting to the brain. It could cause chest pain if there's not enough oxygen being delivered to the heart. The patient will appear pale due to reduced circulation to the skin. Okay? What about the white blood cells? Well, if they're suppressed, again by drugs or some kind of bone marrow disease, the patient will be prone to an assortment of different infections. Okay? Because their ability to create inflammation and infection protection has been reduced. Okay, so less inflammation and less ability to fight infection. And then finally, reduction in platelets will lead to increased potential for bleeding. So bruising of the skin, petechiae, which are those little blood spots of the skin, bleeding gums, bleeding from the gastrointestinal tract. So just an increased potential for bleeding when you have reduced platelets. So let's start talking about white blood cells. And as I mentioned before, there's 5 different types of white blood cells. And you'll notice that the 3 towards the right, which are the neutrophils, the basophils, and eosinophils, they have granules in them. And we'll talk about those later, but we classify those as granulocytes. Okay, so if you see the word granulocyte, it's typically we're referring to neutrophils since they're the most populated type of white blood cell. But a granulocyte can be a neutrophil, a basophil, or eosinophil. The other ones, we don't see granulocytes under the microscope, so we don't refer to them as granulocytes. And those are lymphocytes and monocytes. Remember, the monocytes, when they go into tissue, when they leave the bloodstream, they are renamed and are called macrophages. So throughout your body, you actually have macrophages in your tissues. So you have macrophages in your lung called alveolar macrophages to provide some immune system in your lung. You have macrophages that live in your liver. We call them Kupffer cells. It doesn't matter. I think it just the concept of understanding that there's macrophages throughout many tissues and organs of your body, and they all have the same function to protect the particular organ. Okay, so, and then finally the lymphocytes. We'll spend some more time on these as well. They are a big component of the adaptive immune system. And there's two types. There's the B cells and the T cells. And the B cells are responsible for producing antibodies, and the T cells are also part of the adaptive immune system, and they're responsible for producing what are called cytotoxic T cells and T helper cells. And we'll get into more detail on those later. Okay, so let's continue on with the white blood cell, which is also referred to as a leukocyte. So any of those 5 types of white blood cells are leukocytes. So if I have what's called a leukocytosis, which is an elevation of my white blood cell count, that could be an elevation of any of those white blood cell types. Okay, and you'll see when we get into details, it matters which white blood cell is elevated. It can help us think of which potential infection is invading the body. Okay, when we talk about leukopenia, we're referring to the white blood cell count being decreased as a whole. Okay, and that's going to matter as well. So if someone's leukopenic, they're at higher risk for infection since they have abnormally low white blood cells. Okay, so all of the white blood cells are actually produced in the bone marrow. Okay, and they all have nuclei, unlike red blood cells that do not have nuclei when they're in the bloodstream, or platelets. Platelets are just little fragments of a larger cell in the bone marrow called a megakaryocyte. And platelets just break off the megakaryocyte and then circulate in the bloodstream. Okay, as I mentioned, white blood cells are broken up into 5 categories, and we'll review each category and the function of each white blood cell category. And really only about 1% of your total blood volume is made up of white blood cells, compared to 40 to 45% of your blood volume is made up of red blood cells. So if you were holding up a test tube and we spun the test tube down in a centrifuge, we would barely see the line that makes up the white blood cells. But almost half of the tube would be filled with red blood cells. Okay, and then the other half of the tube would be filled with serum, right? So even though it's a tiny fraction of the overall blood volume, white blood cells provide an amazing amount of protection to the body, and they're heavily involved in inflammation in the body. Okay, so as I mentioned, leukocytosis is an elevated white blood cell level, which can indicate either an infection or inflammation that's occurring in the body. Leukopenia is a low white blood cell level, which often is indicating immunosuppression. Something is happening in the body that's suppressing the white blood cells, and now the patient is immunosuppressed. So what are they at risk for? Well, in the short term, they're at risk for an assortment of infections that invade the body. If somebody has long-term immunosuppression, well, they are at risk for a variety of cancers as well, since the immune system is constantly on the lookout for any cells that are becoming cancerous, and typically it will destroy them. So if you have chronic immunosuppression, you are at higher risk for developing different types of cancers in the body. Okay, so let's talk about tissues of the immune system. Where does the immune system exist in the body? So the first one is the bone marrow, and this is where all white blood cells are produced, right? And the white blood cells are heavily involved in the immune system. So for example, your lymphocytes, which are one type of white blood cell, well, they're produced in the bone marrow, and the B cells, which are a type of lymphocyte, mature in the bone marrow and then get released into the bloodstream. So all the white blood cells will enter the bloodstream or go into what's called the lymphatic system and provide immunity to the body, or immune protection to the body. Okay. There's another tissue called the thymus, which is directly behind your sternum. And as a child, the thymus is actually quite large. Okay, it occupies a large portion behind your sternum within your chest. And as the child grows and becomes an adult, the thymus gradually shrinks to a much smaller size. Okay? And the thymus is where T cells mature. So T cells are a type of lymphocyte. They're still produced in the bone marrow, but they mature within another immune tissue called the thymus. Okay? And the thymus can be reactivated if necessary. So if there is a significant infection occurring in the body that requires more T cells to mature, the thymus can be reactivated. But in general, I would remember that the thymus is much more active in a child compared to an adult. So if we look at the slide on the right, the immune system really includes a lot of different tissues. So the adenoids and the tonsils that are in your throat, the thymus gland, all the lymph nodes that are throughout your body that drain the lymphatic ducts. So all throughout our tissue and our skin, we have these little lymphatic ducts, and they go to lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes will process any potential antigens or infections that are trying to enter the body. The spleen, again, another important part of the immune system. There's some parts of the colon that we think have a role in the immune system, such as the appendix. And as I mentioned before, the bone marrow being a very important part of the immune system. Okay, so the next tissue of the immune system are the lymph nodes and lymphatics. So really throughout our body, we have lymphatic ducts. So they're through the tissue of your arms, your legs, they're within your abdomen, they drain from your head, they're all over the place. And lymphatic ducts connect to lymph nodes. Okay, and we typically have areas of the body that have significantly more lymph nodes that process the lymph fluid coming to them. So in your axilla, under your armpits, in your groin, in your neck, within your chest cavity, the thorax, and within your abdomen. But essentially, they're also in many, many other places, okay? And what they do is they assess and look at the foreign material that has entered tissue. So the foreign material goes into the lymphatic ducts and then gets presented to lymph nodes that then react to the foreign material. Okay, so there's immune cells within the lymph nodes that can deal with the foreign antigen or infection that are trying to enter the body. Okay. The other role of the lymphatics is to absorb extra fluid and waste from tissues. So remember, capillaries go through organs throughout the body, and they deliver oxygen and glucose and other nutrients, and then there's an oncotic pressure that brings the fluid back into the bloodstream, but it doesn't typically bring all the fluid back and all the waste back. So the extra fluid and waste is taken care of by the lymphatic tissue and the lymphatic ducts that finally all drain back into the central vascular system. Okay, so when all the lymphatics have accumulated their fluid and waste, they finally drain back into the bloodstream. Okay, the spleen, that's an important immune organ. So it's constantly filtering antigens that it's detecting within the blood. And B cells and T cells exist within the spleen. They're living there, okay? And they are on the lookout for any potential infection within the blood. The other function of the spleen is to destroy old red blood cells. So red blood cells typically live for around 100 to 120 days. And how are they destroyed? Well, the spleen is able to detect changes in red blood cells as they age, and it destroys them. Okay, so let's get into the 5 types of leukocytes, or 5 types of white blood cells. And in the first category, we're going to have 3, and in the second category, we'll have 2. And it's only because, as I mentioned before, the first category are what are called granulocytes. Okay, so we'll talk about the granulocytes first, and we just call them granulocytes because when we stain them under a microscope, we can see these granules within them. And the most important granulocyte is the neutrophil. So the neutrophil makes up 50 to 70% of your white blood cell count. So it's the most numerous white blood cell in the body. And that makes sense when we think about the role of the neutrophil. In the last module, we spoke about the neutrophils being heavily involved in the inflammatory process, where they come and help the macrophages and respond to any potential invaders or antigens that are entering the body. So really, they're the first to arrive to inflammation or infection, typically within hours. Okay, so pretty amazing white blood cell. They don't live very long, right? So they're highly active. They respond very quickly, but they don't live very long, 1 to 2 days. And neutrophils are often increased in the setting of bacterial infections. And that's why we often look at the overall white blood cell count. But then after looking at the overall white blood cell count, we look at what's called the differential of the white blood cell count, meaning how is the white blood cell count broken down into its different 5 types. And in particular, we're looking at the neutrophils and the lymphocytes. So we want to know if the neutrophils are very elevated as part of an elevated white blood cell count, since they are typically increased in bacterial infections. So for example, if you have a white blood cell count of 20,000, normal being 5,000 to 10,000, and most of that elevation in the white blood cell count are neutrophils, say 19,000 of them, then that's a very strong indication that there's a bacterial infection within the body. Okay? And remember, the neutrophils are responsible for phagocytosis of antigens along with the macrophages. Okay, so neutrophils we're going to talk about again because they're so important to fighting bacterial infections. So if the neutrophils were significantly diminished in the body, meaning you have what's called neutropenia, that really sets up a situation where now the patient is at high risk for developing a bacterial infection. Okay? Because if their white blood cell count is reduced, and the greatest reduction in the white blood cell count is in the neutrophils, that's very concerning for that patient to potentially develop an overwhelming bacterial infection. And we'll talk about that. Okay? Let's go to another granulocyte, far less numerous than neutrophils, called eosinophils. So these aren't listed in terms of how numerous they are. Eosinophils only make up 0 to 4% of white blood cells. They just happen to be a granulocyte, so that's why they're listed here. And eosinophils typically live in mucous membranes, such as your digestive tract and your lungs. Okay? And they're responsible for responding to allergies, such as hay fever or asthma. And partly they can be elevated in certain parasitic infections. So I would think of an elevation of your eosinophil count as being caused by either some kind of allergic reaction in the body or a parasitic infection in the body. Okay, the third type of leukocyte, which is still a granulocyte, is called a basophil. Okay, and basophils make up a small percentage of your overall white blood cell count, 0 to 2%. So it's the lowest white blood cell circulating in the bloodstream. And basophils are responsible for releasing histamine in inflammatory reactions. That leads to vasodilation of blood vessels. So that sounds very similar to mast cells that are in your tissues throughout your body that do the same thing when invaders or antigens enter the tissue. Mast cells release histamine. Well, that's what basophils do as well. In actual fact, in the past, we used to think that basophils and mast cells were the same type of cell, but we no longer think that. Basophils are in your bloodstream, and they release histamine within the bloodstream to increase the inflammatory response and cause vasodilation. Okay. They also can release a compound called heparin. And heparin is a compound that inhibits coagulation. So by inhibiting coagulation, it allows more permeability of the blood vessels. Okay, I would think of basophils more in terms of releasing histamine and causing vasodilation and leaky blood vessels. Okay, so when are basophils elevated? Well, typically again in allergic type reactions such as asthma, eczema, allergic reactions in the body, and sometimes in parasitic infections. Okay, so there's definitely some similarities between eosinophils and basophils, because you heard that they're both they both can be elevated in allergic reactions and parasitic infections. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to the remaining two leukocytes. So we've done three, which are in the granulocyte group, and now we're going to talk about lymphocytes and monocytes. And we don't see granules in them when we look under the microscope, so we call them agranulocytes. Okay, A meaning missing, so agranulocytes. Okay, so lymphocytes, second most common white blood cell in the bloodstream in terms of how numerous they are. 20 to 40% of your white blood cells are lymphocytes. And remember that lymphocytes are part of the adaptive immune system. So they're going to consist of either B cells or T cells. And lymphocytes are often increased in viral infections or when the body's fighting a type of cancer. You can get a lymphocytosis. So let me give you an example. A patient that comes in with a really sore throat, swollen glands in their neck, they feel incredibly tired, and we diagnose mononucleosis, which is a viral infection. When we do a CBC, a complete blood count, we're looking for a lymphocytosis because the lymphocytes typically go up in viral infections. Okay, so if we see an overall elevation of your white blood cell count, and most of that elevation is due to extra lymphocytes, it's usually due to a viral infection. Okay. The last one, monocytes, well, they make up about 4 to 8% of your white blood cells in your body, and they are the ones that become macrophages within the tissues of your body, right? And they provide protection to an assortment of tissues in your body. I mentioned the lungs, the liver, they're in the spleen, they're in your tissue of the skin, they're all over the place, okay? And we just love to call them different names depending on where they live. So Kupffer cells in the liver, there's some osteoclasts in the bones that are monocytes, alveolar macrophages. I don't think the actual names are critical. I think it would be a good idea to maybe remember some of them, such as Kupffer cells or macrophages in the liver. Alveolar macrophages are clearly in the lung, and they just provide immune protection to those organs. And how do they do that? Phagocytosis, right? Engulfing the microbe or the antigen and then digesting and destroying it.